me, art is, because I'm a conceptual artist, art is just like the middle between things. So I make an art, it no longer belongs to me, it belongs to the viewer. And it's a middleman between the viewer and anything else. So in some ways, the artist can be an antenna, right? All art is, between you and beauty, or you and whatever painting it is that you're doing, whatever you're trying to reach, it makes its connection. That's what it makes.
The three artists that we're going to hear from this evening has collectively shown their artworks at museums across the Western Hemisphere. The first of those three artists is Brett Amory. Brett has sold out shows from London, England, to Los Angeles, California, and New York City. Beyond the sold-out gallery shows, Brett has shown his artwork at the National Gallery of Art in Edinburgh, Scotland, the National Portrait Gallery in London, England, and perhaps testament to the beauty of his creativity is he is without a doubt a painter's painter, someone that is deeply admired by his peers for his technical acumen with traditional oil paint. In the last handful of years, he's begun to incorporate new technologies into those traditional media, using large language models and artificial generative intelligence to do so. More recently, he was awarded the prestigious Jackson Pollock Lee Krasner Foundation grant. Here tonight to tell us about that confluence of his creativity and his artistic practice, please welcome to the stage, ladies and gentlemen, through a round of applause, Brett Amory.
Hello. Thank you for having me, Commonwealth Club, and thank you, Hugh, for that gracious or that nice introduction. So I want to start the talk about my history, or my relationship with technology. I'm kind of in between a techno optimist and a doomer. I'm not quite a doomer, and the more I use advanced technologies, the more concerned I become. But I'm also very optimistic and excited about how accessible these tools are. I moved to San Francisco in the late 90s, and my first job was FedEx Kinko's, which is Kinko's back then. And when we would get slow at work, I would experiment with the copy machines. I moved out here to study film, so I wasn't painting or making installations. So when we get slow at work, I would experiment with the copy machines and try to get them to do things that they weren't necessarily designed to do, use them in unconventional ways, try to kind of break them in some ways. That process led to using an experiment with Photoshop and scanning my drawings in collages, weird collages that I'd make at Kinko's, and experiment with it, with those collages. That process led to painting, or drawing, painting, where I eventually got my undergrad in painting. And the process of using Photoshop to compose digital composites for paintings has always been part of my process. All of my work usually starts out with a digital image or some sort of composite or montage of some sorts, and then that image is translated either into a drawing and then a painting, or a study and then a larger painting. In 2015, I came across the Celebrity GAN. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that. It's Ian Goodfellow. It was inspired by Ian Goodfellow's paper on generative adversarial networks. And the Celebrity GAN was basically a neural network that was generating images of people that don't exist. And when I saw that, it really blew me away. So from that point on, I really wanted to learn how to program these things. Now, I'm not a programmer, I don't code, and I quickly realized that form of programming, designing neural networks, machine learning, is very sophisticated. Between 2015 and 2022, I took a couple classes in Python trying to learn how to program so I could try to learn how to design neural networks to use in my work, and I quickly would give up. 2021, I got COVID, and during COVID, I was determined to learn how to program. So I signed up for a boot camp in Udemy in Python, and I was doing 3 hours a day tutorials. And then after COVID, I was done with COVID. I did a 10-day silent retreat. And when they lifted the vial of silence, that's when you get to meet everyone. And there are about 25 men at this retreat, 25 men, but women, and they separate the men from the women. And at the end of the retreat is when you get to talk and meet everyone. And I started talking to some of these men, and I would say 20 out of the 25 men were machine learning engineers. And one of those engineers was Ilya Sutskever, and I didn't know who he was at the time. And we were having conversations about, programming and where it was going, or machine learning, where it was going. And he told me not to worry about learning how to code because everything was about to change. So I got out of that retreat in August of 2021, and in November, ChatGPT was released to the public. And the first thing that I did was had ChatGPT generate code and teach me how to run that code to collage 3 images together. That was like the only parameters that I set. And these are some of the images that I had ChatGPT write code to collage. So when I got out of that retreat, the whole wave of text-to-image generation and then just AI, generative art or generative AI started. These are some of the images that I started collaging or started using text-to-image generation platforms to play around with. This was like the first idea I had using text-to-image platforms was to generate images, to create some sort of disruption similar to what I was doing at Kinko's with the copy machines. So I generated a text prompt that didn't make a lot of sense. There's some existential language buried in between, like a lot of nonsensical language, latchkey symbols and Unicode, and just a lot of gibberish. And I would take that prompt and generate thousands of images to see how the image would change over time without changing the prompt. So one of the first ideas was just to use the same prompt over and over and over on the same platform to see how the image would change and try to create some sort of disruption within the model. And then I would take that same prompt and try to use it on different platforms. So start out with Crayon and then DALL-E and Stable Diffusion, Midjourney, and use the same prompt across different platforms to see how the image would change based on the different data sets. And those were like some of the first parameters or like some of the first ideas I was playing with image generation. And I wasn't doing anything other than generating images at that point and experimenting. And these are some of the example images that I generated initially with just using that same prompt. And then after experimenting for about 3 months, I probably generated close to 100,000 images. I started taking some of those images, say like 1 out of 1,000 images, and taking that into Photoshop and adding and subtracting from that image, and then outputting as either a screen print or a screen print base layer and adding paint on top of it. So I started making objects from some of the selected images that fit some sort of narrative or theme that I was going for. And it was almost like it was somewhat of a back and forth process where I would take one image, take it in Photoshop, add and subtract from it to it, and then output that as screen print process, take a photograph of it, and upload the image back into Photoshop or some generative AI platform, and either expand it or add things to it, and then output it again. And the second layer would be maybe airbrush or oil, some sort of oil painting. And I would start out with studies first, smaller paintings, or just would incorporate 4-color process screen printing and figure out how I was going to paint it larger. So these are some of the images, the initial images that I was painting from the text image generation images that I was generating. And this is the one on the left is a digital montage, and then the one on the right is a study, which is a little bit smaller. And then that study was used to figure out how to make a bigger painting. And then these are this is like the bigger painting that was generated from, or made from the study and the digital collage. And again, same thing, this is the digital montage and then a study with a little bit of oil painting embellishment. And then the larger painting was made from that. In 2021, or actually beginning of 2022, I was added to the artist beta list, or the DALL-E gave me a bunch of credits to try out their DALL-E 3.0. And I took that same prompt that I had been using over and over and over, and I added more nonsensical language to it to try to create like more of a disruption. DALL-E started giving me these weird images that looked like alien advertisements with indecipherable text. And it took me a little while to figure out to realize that this was the glitch that I was looking for. So I started the first body of work after using image generation for a couple of years. First body of work that was called Avatars of Our Own Making, and it was about the disruption of communication and language. And it was right around the same time where like the hallucinations were starting to be talked about, and how these LLMs were hallucinating and just doing things that they weren't designed to do. And these are some of the other images, and I started realizing how using generative AI was more than just using like Photoshop or a tool. It became almost like a collaborator in some ways, and it was multimodal. So I was teaching an AI in traditional art class, and one of the first things I tell my students is don't marry yourself to one application or one platform or one tool, because as technology changes too fast, there's the exponential growth curve is just moving exponentially every week. So it's more important to come up with a workflow and this multimodal way of working. So I realized that using these tools was like a way to generate ideas, and it was almost like this feedback loop where it's feeding back into itself and kind of creating or like recreating itself and generating new ideas from itself. And this is like more images from avatars of our own making. Last November, I had an exhibition in Oakland, and the entire exhibition started out with one text prompt. This is the image that was generated. It was a black and white image, 512 by 512, and then I took that image and expanded it in Photoshop to be 168 inches by 130 inches, and then output that this 4-color process screen print 4-color process. And this was the backdrop for an installation that was in the gallery. The backdrop was then photographed and then uploaded back into Photoshop, where I added more elements to it, so you can see some of the language and parts of it. So I digitally edited the original, or the photograph that was taken of the original backdrop screen print, then added more things to it, and then output it again as 4-color process screen printing on top of it, and then photographed that, imported it back into Photoshop, and then added images or collaged images for these paintings. And some of the paintings that are coming off are a combination of oil painting and screen print process. So this part here in the middle, the figure is oil painting, and the part on the right is screen print, 4-color process screen printing. And this is all oil painting. So at this point, had thousands of images that I had generated, and a lot of these images had that indecipherable text, and that indecipherable language started giving me ideas to create something larger than just a body of work of images or installations. And I started thinking about creating some sort of fictitious religion based on like some of the stuff that I was generating. But then I realized I'm not really religious, didn't grow up studying religion, so I scrapped that idea, and then I was going to create some sort of like fictitious cult. But I don't really know much about cults, so I didn't do that. And then I started thinking about the way evolution, the way we've evolved, or the human species has evolved, and we evolved through language. So I started creating a constructed language last January called AI Glyphic 913, and it's turned into like this world building project. So now all the work that I make kind of gets channeled through AI Glyphic 913 and NUM, and it's turned into like this like bigger project. And a lot of the thematic structure behind it is dealing with like some of the ethical implications around the way in which like effective accelerationism and transhumanism and just the speed at which these technologies are moving. And it's a way for me to think about it and work through some of the, some of the angst I have around the rate at which technology is moving. At the same time, I was realizing like I could generate like 100 images watching TV, right, watching a movie. And I realized that I could just continuously generate images and I wasn't doing anything with them. And it was really similar to like scrolling social media. And it was kind of giving me like this like serotonin or dopamine hit. And I started thinking about like fast fashion and just like social media, and it really caused me, or I started thinking about slowing down and getting back to the handmade object. So I started studying with this painter in Santa Cruz, and I've been learning the Venetian glazing technique, which is I've really started. I think it was Titian came up with it in the 1500s or 16th century Baroque, and it's what Rembrandt used, and it's the apex of oil painting. So it's like very illusionistic and optical. So the idea was to incorporate that into the series and a way to slow down the process, but also merge it with this rapid pace of image generation. And this is one of the first images that utilizes that technique. And then Bully Rat is part of AI Glyphic 913. It's like a construct within the language. So now the language and NUM, which is the backstory of the language, the origin story, determines like these philosophical constructs for different bodies of work. And then this Kistamata is another body of work within NUM and AI Glyphic 913, and it deals more with like merging with technology and transhumanism and extropianism. And this part here is utilizing that Venetian glazing technique and screen print outside. Then Makedas Kanangtung is another construct within NUM and AI Glyphic 913. And that's it. Thank you.
One more time for Brett. Thank you, Brett. Our second presenter this evening is Anna Gershik. Anna earned a PhD in vision science from UC Berkeley. She has dedicated more than 2 decades of research to the way that these new technologies, such as artificial intelligence, view the world that you and I collectively live in, as well as the real-world implications of these technologies. Along the way, she's earned 5 patents and published more than 20 peer-reviewed papers on the subject. That research and information forms a foundation of inspiration for her visual art practice. And those artworks she has shown at New York City's Museum of Modern Art, as well as the Contemporary Jewish Museum, and countless other institutions and museums across the United States. Perhaps the best testament to the beauty of her creativity is her list of collaborators. She's collaborated with everyone from composer of classical music Philip Glass to multi-platinum Grammy Award-winning artist Bjork, as well as perhaps most beautifully, her husband, who is here in the audience with us this evening. Here tonight to tell us about this confluence of research, as well as the real-world implications of these new technologies and her creativity, please welcome to the stage with a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, Anna Gershik.
Thank you. Thank you, Hugh, for that kind intro and for organizing tonight. So I put the word secret in my title, in part just to get your attention, but in part also because I felt like I had a secret. So as you said, I'm trained in visual neuroscience and the science of AI vision. And during my research, I would frequently stumble upon views into the brain and views into an AI's visual processing unit that I just thought were really interesting, powerful, beautiful, and weren't really widely known outside of a small group of technical experts. So they became the topic of my research and also my art practice, which is what I'm going to tell you about tonight. So I think you all know the 5 senses. My specialty is the visual sense, and it's not just the eye, it's really the set of computations that happens in the brain to transform light coming into it's an algorithm, into a visual percept. And there's an analogy with AI vision, so the smartphone cameras you have, or maybe it's a security camera, or maybe you took a Waymo here, or a medical imaging device. Like, they all have these cameras, and then there's an analogous algorithm that transforms that signal into, whether it be face recognition or the technology underlying generative AI that Brett was talking about. That it's analogous between humans and AIs, and I'm really interested in some of the similarities between human and AI vision. So for one, they all use visual training data. So that's coming from the visual environment, whether it comes from your eyes or from a set of photos on the internet or videos. It's a large volume of visual training data. And then from there, the purpose of learning is to basically condense that training data into something that can be reused. And so it's a relatively small number of what I'm calling visual primitives here. You could think of these as what the neurons learn. And that's where my research is in those visual primitives. And those are useful because then they can be recombined in many complex ways to form this really robust and flexible perceptual system. And I've kind of simplified it here, but humans and AIs really share this common learning approach. With human learning, it's over the course of evolution as well as during our lifetimes. Okay, so this was inspirational for me as a scientist. As early as in the 1600s, it was recommended for a wealthy art patron who wanted to form an art collection to actually not just put paintings in it and art, but also put these collections of scientific specimens, often naturalist specimens like this. This is a collection of butterflies in Vienna. And so the specimens were part science, part entertainment, and meant to wonder. And so I felt like I had a lot of specimens. They weren't naturalist specimens, but technological specimens. And so I started to gather them and think about ways of displaying them. And these patterns here I actually got from Inception, which is a 2014 model from Google. It's open source, so I can actually open it up and look inside, and it's just a jumble of numbers, but you can visualize the numbers and start to figure out what patterns the neurons learned. And those are those visual primitives I was talking about. And so by creating this collection of technological specimens, I felt like I was preserving an important moment of AI history. That 2014 time is when these models really started taking off for the first time. And this one is actually now hanging down the road at the new UC Law building across from their technological law lab. And so here's one that you can see a little closer up view. And I'm going to walk you through some examples of my artwork and share some of the properties of these visual primitives. So the first property is that they're emergent. Even though I designed the artwork, the patterns themselves I didn't design. They emerged through the training algorithm, which I think is pretty cool because it's kind of like I'm working collaboratively with them and I don't have full control over them. Another property is that these primitives are the optimal distillation of the training data, which basically just means that during the training, they optimally figured out how to divvy up the space, and each neuron was like, I'll take this corner, I'll take this corner, and then they distilled the photographs down. So like none of these patterns you would directly see in a photograph, or you're not seeing corners of the photographs in these patterns, rather you're seeing distillations of common patterns that felt important to the learning algorithm. So this one is a little more complex in the patterns. And so that's also a property, is that these AIs they're deep learning algorithms. So that means they have a lot of layers of neurons, and the early layers tend to be really simple. They focus on like what they call edge detection. So it's like a black-white edge. And then later layers become more and more complex until you get like face detectors. I was really excited when I found this layer. I've labeled them all with the layers in. So this is called Inception Layer 3A. And I feel like it's my favorite layer because it's much more complex than a simple edge. There's a lot of richness to these patterns. And yet they're still abstract. You can't quite put them into words and describe what they are. Here's another one from the same series. Another way to think about this is that together a set of these would form a visual grammar. And so it's like a language. It's each one of them you could think of as a visual phoneme that is actually quite powerful, because when you put them all together, like this is the technology that would be underneath like Google image search, for example. Okay, so you might be thinking, okay, that was an old model. I said it was 10 years old. And technology has advanced quite a lot in the past 10 years, especially this type of technology. So actually, yes, the technology has advanced, but the primitives are relatively similar even in today's technology. They're not exactly the same, but conceptually the gist of them is similar, and especially at those early layers. And so what that points to is that the training data, there's something universal in the training data that they're capturing, regardless of how advanced the technology gets. Which I find pretty exciting. And even more exciting is that these primitives are not just shared across AI models, but also humans and other mammals. Conceptually, they're very similar, especially those early layers. So that's not to say that humans and AI brains are the same. It's more pointing to that they share a common learning process, and also somewhat similar training data. And so all these learning systems are picking up on certain elements in the training data, in the visual training data, in the world we live in. So that was also, okay, sorry, now we're jumping to another project. So this is a series of photographs I took near my West Berkeley studio. And at that time, I was thinking a lot about my postdoctoral research, where I had been looking for patterns in nature, actually, photos of nature, and looking for certain elements that seem to have worked their way into the primitives in human brains and other species' brains. And then also thinking about how those got into AIs. And now AIs are looking at nature. So it kind of goes back to nature being the original training data. And in this series, I'm just kind of contemplating that cycle of it all connecting. And this is another one from that series. just again thinking about how like AI would see nature. Okay, and then this one, I wanted to make a window where one could look through the window and have that experience of AI perception, like the initial moment of AI perception. So this is actually the first convolutional layer. And this is a different model. It's AlexNet, so it's actually came out in 2012. Excuse me. It was the first deep learning model to like pass this ImageNet challenge, which is a kind of well-known benchmark. So it generated a lot of excitement. And like you might be thinking, why these patterns? Like, why are they so? They're so simple, but like I'm telling you, they're so powerful. And so the visual task for humans and AIs is actually like a really hard technical task. And so the primitives are super helpful just for optimizing vision because they tell us like what to look for. And so it's a shortcut for the brain or for a visual system. Here's another one I did in that series. And the flip side of being helpful is actually bias. So we hear a lot about AI bias, and there's rightly some fears around it. When I hear bias, I think about like my perceptual research, and perceptual research bias has a very precise technical definition, which is basically the difference between what we perceive and what's really there. And so the bigger the bias, the bigger that difference is. And in my research, I had showed that these perceptual visual primitives are basically a source of bias because they tell us what to look for. So if you have an idea of if you're out searching for something, your perception tends to go towards that. So another way to think about this window is the first moment of AI bias when you look through that window. I've also made these mirrors now, and so it's a similar idea, but instead you can look at yourself through the mirror and like think about bias head on. And then this is just some recent experimentation I've been doing, working with glass powders on glass to make glass windows. And so I just want to wrap up with summarizing a little bit. So these visual primitives I told you about, they're both my scientific research area, but they're also my artistic material. And they're learned by brains and AIs because they're helpful, and they seem to be derived from universal patterns in our visual environment. And they're both helpful and they're biasing. So I know the theme of tonight's talk was threat or opportunity. And so in that sense, they're both kind of a threat and opportunity in one. So there's my contact info if you want to learn more. I also do open studios once a year, and it just happens to be on Saturday. So if you're interested to come by, there's the information. And I think that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna. One more time for Anna. Thank you. Thank you for the education. The third and final presenter this evening is Sirifei Wong. Sirifei will be our final presenter before we go to the panel discussion. So if you are wanting to share a question through the community's collective curiosity, once we come to the panel discussion after Sirifei's presentation and you haven't yet done so, now is a great time to do that. As we see, there are question cards going around if you haven't already shared your question. After we do the panel discussion, we're all going to go out the double doors behind you into the atrium and continue this very important civic discourse. So if your question does not get asked during the Q&A of the panel portion of this, please be the person who does ask that question when we are in the atrium continuing the civic discourse over a glass of wine. At the same time, we will have the opportunity to meet Nunatai. This is a realistic portrait drawing robot built on 60,000 lines of code written by Steve Milbrow. Sirifei Wong, our third and final presenter this evening, is the founder of Icarus Salon. Icarus Salon brings together creatives to focus on the ideas of art, activism, and politics. Sarife, for her part, has garnered numerous awards and foundational backing from the Berggruen Institute, the Rockefeller Foundation. She's also gained opportunities from Kid Lab at UC Berkeley, Creative Capital, and Mozilla Foundation. She also sits on the board at the Agraria Foundation, which for more than 20 years has been the bedrock and cornerstone of the art and tech community here in San Francisco. Sarife's projects are inspiring in the way that they bring together art and academic research into the realm of activism. That is a big part of what she does with her current projects and beyond. Here tonight to tell us about her creative practice, the idea of academic research and activism, please welcome to the stage with a round of applause, Sarife Wong.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I have notes because this is a very fresh talk. Great. So my name is Sarife Wong, and I'm a conceptual artist. So I don't really give talks about my work. I consider giving talks actually just part of my art practice. I do a lot of different sort of pieces on websites or performance art. So for me, this is a performance art piece. And welcome to my talk, Artists and AI, Best Not to Skip. Therapy this week. Please go. Especially all those artists, 50%, right? So these are some of the questions I've gotten in the past 8 years of my practice giving these talks. Are artists real artists? Are AI artists real artists? Yes, they are. And is AI conscious? No. Will rogue AI take over the world? No. Okay, great. We will move on. So let's talk about the real stuff here. We're really talking about money and power, because that's what AI is all about. Artists, we know a lot about the AI market because it is very, very similar to the art market. Billionaires are there, right? And there's also a ton of people in the industry who are barely making ends meet. And even when the product doesn't seem to have any practical use at all and not functional, people still believe it can change the world. Sam Altman here, who's given a talk here, he's the CEO of OpenAI that makes DALL-E and ChatGPT. He is now looking for $7 trillion of investment in AI. Now, I gotta get, like, how much is that? How much is that? All right, so artists, right? We are a talented bunch of hustlers, too. We just sold a banana that is duct taped to a wall for $6.2 million, and the buyer of it, he ate it, right? He ate it, you guys, he just ate it. But you cannot eat 1 million bananas. The math does not work out, just like AI. So the AI market is more bananas than the art market. So if it's not art jobs that's worth $7 trillion, what is? AI tools can be used in creative ways, but the creative industries are peanuts next to the big contracts from the military. Microsoft is one of the largest military contractors in the United States. The art stuff is a trick. How do I know it's a trick? I recognize them because I am married to a magician, Brad Barton, reality thief, available for Christmas parties. Brad is a mentalist, which means he can read minds and he makes predictions. So he pretty much can do what tech companies want us to think AI can do. But there's a really big difference. At a magic show, you agree to get fooled. The magician knows you and he shows you what he wants you to see. With AI marketing, there is no disclaimer. Companies direct your attention to the magic of instant art and poems, and they're hiding their tricks. Generative AI is a tool of power masquerading as a tool of knowledge. And this marketing, it had better work. There's a lot of money riding on it. We have got to buy those products. We need smartphones, smart watches, smart homes, smart cities. Every time you see the word smart, replace it with the word surveillance, because that is what AI is. Ah, man. Therapy. Remember. So AI is a tool, but it's not merely a tool for creativity. It's a tool for control. AI is a vast surveillance infrastructure. ChatGPT works because it's trained on data. Every time you use it, it collects your data. Everything you put in, but even that is not enough. Companies need more data. Data takes up space, it uses up energy, and it's bundled together with buildings, cables, satellites, mechanisms, institutions. You can buy, say, and anybody, right? You can buy and sell data, stockpile and use data. So data centers are devouring power. Already, 32% of Ireland's electricity goes to data centers. That is the next milestone here in the United States. And so please think of California's grid. Think of our fires. Big tech's carbon emissions are soaring 30% from AI. Their solution is to buy and invest in nuclear power. That's where they're at. And who's really going to pay for all that, right? It's the poor, the marginalized. The land is, the land that they're putting data centers on, that's not right here in our backyard. That's over there, right? Somewhere else. And also, labor is exploited in these systems. People are training these tools and cleaning them up all over the world, getting paid like $1 an hour. People are being processed through systems using facial recognition. The governments control, deport, imprison, and even kill people using AI. This isn't about technology and art, it's kind of about who is going to get to survive. I really love this painting. It's by Walton Ford, Fallen Bough. It's the extinction of the passenger pigeon. And it hosts some of my concerns that I have with AI. My main one is that power is getting concentrated. Only a handful of companies have the wealth and compute power to build these systems. And their monopoly, like the monopoly they've had over the internet, it's not just economic. It's a way to shift power to whoever gets to hold those strings. Look at Elon Musk and Trump right now. All of these concerns culminate towards a troubling direction. Everything made visible to machines becomes easier to control. That's an infrastructure of authoritarianism, whether wielded by states or companies. They're not separate problems. It's the system working as it was designed. We have to think of AI in its context. AI is situated in a political economy, and it's in service to big tech companies and not in service to the public interest, right? So what should artists do with that knowledge? Whose power should we uphold? I'm criticizing AI because I really love AI. Blade Runner is like my favorite movie. I've loved AI. We've all loved AI. We've all seen those movies. It clouds our judgment, in some ways, because we automatically think it's so smart and we love it. And I love technology. I want it to be used well. I want artists to code, build, create, whether they use AI or not. But we have to see through the marketing. Art washing is old. Powerful interests have always used art to distract us from what they don't want us to see. Are we using the tools, or are the tools using us? Artists know how to see. Both art and AI are in service to a vision. Do we want to serve the vision of the already rich and powerful, or do we want to claim the power of the arts as our own? These are some recommendations I have. If you want, you can take out your phone and take a picture. Ruha Benjamin, Dan McQuillan, Kathy O'Neill, Timnit Gebru, and Khadija Abdurrahman's Logic magazine. They're great sources for information to learn about the concentration of power. And I also have my own public education forum. I'm doing performance art on TikTok and Instagram, trying to reach young people. But I have this website, Artificial Life Coach, and it has a whole bunch of resources for everyone. It has artists, activists, papers. It makes AI really accessible for people, and you can learn about some of the impacts they have as well. All right, thank you.
I'd now like to invite all three of the artists to join me for our panel discussion this evening. This is where we will focus on your questions that have been shared with Gerald Harris, who's now walking around. If you can get him your question, and we will focus on those in just a moment here. So tapping into the collective curiosity of our community. As mentioned, if we don't get to your question, please be the person who does ask that question at a time that civic discourse is more important now than ever before on these topics that will not just change the art world, but will change society as a whole. We will do that in just a moment when we go out beyond the double doors and consider the civic discourse over a glass of wine, as well as meeting No Not I, the realistic portrait drawing robot. So I'm going to have a seat, and we're going to start focusing on your questions here. You mentioned the perspective that is perhaps very rightfully cynical. I think that it seems like on one hand, there is a fear of displacement of the artist, and you take a more macro perspective on this, beyond just the arts, and almost a societal perspective, which I think is very justified. Do you see some form of where you think, like, oh my goodness, this might be a very positive for the arts, for artists? Is there something that might be the opposite end of the spectrum from what you just shared with us?
Yeah, I mean, I do have a positive example because I don't like big tech companies kind of meddling in the arts, but AI systems don't necessarily have to come from those places, right? There is a really great little group called Te Huku Media in New Zealand, and it's a Maori communications media group. And they were pitched to give their language, the Maori language, up to a company that was working for OpenAI, but to train ChatGPT on. And they said no, because they compared it to sort of colonialism, right? They're like, you want to take our language now for $20 for 2 hours, and then you'll sell it back to us later. So instead, there was a computer scientist working there, and he Googled and he taught himself how to do, just like you, he learned how to do some AI. And he made their own system, and they trained their own system for language. So all those kind of rewards of preserving indigenous languages is really, really important. And young people are on computers, they're on, they're not talking amongst themselves, and people are all over the world, right? So technology can bring people closer together, and AI systems can help preserve and help people communicate, right? But it needs to be bottom up, and that's when I'm really supportive of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I want to go then and turn our attention, thank you, Gerald, to your perspective, Brett. You seem to take a unique, almost contrarian perspective on this, where it seems like a lot of artists, particularly painters and people that are really knee-deep in traditional media, feeling a sense of fear around the potential that it's going to infringe on them. But with your artwork, you really seem to find a place of empowerment with pulling it into your painting process, and it's almost become very informative and inspiring for you. How do you see this dichotomy of good versus bad, displacement versus empowerment?
I think it's important to have the understanding that these tools are being marketed to us as make things more convenient. Mm-hmm. My approach using these tools is more of they're sort of more than tools for me. Like they're these collaborators, but I think you have to be critical of what they offer. I don't think they're necessarily going to replace the artist. It's important to have a vision and a voice, and not rely solely on the technology to generate the work. Mm-hmm. I think I come from a unique perspective where I had to practice for 25 years before using advanced technology. I mean, technology has always been a part of the process, but not like generative AI is. I've gotten into a lot of conversations with traditional artists about using these tools, and it's a lot like talking about politics. There's a lot of pushback and resistance, and I understand that pushback, and I can see why people are scared and don't want to use it. I think my approach is unique because I've used different things like Photoshop. That's what actually got me into traditional object making. But I think it is important to be critical. The more I use it, the more critical I become, and it's probably because the more research I do and the more I learn about how technology is being marketed to us, and I think it is something to take in consideration, and use it with I don't know, just be mindful of that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you. So there's a couple of these that have a bit of overlap, and I think to kind of collate a couple of these together, it speaks directly to something that your research goes to, Anna, the idea around the real-world implications of this. of using these technologies. If we are to go ahead in the future, 10 years, looking back on today, what would be the warning to ourselves of like, oh my God, what are the real world implications of whether it be kids getting on there and using these things, or if it's just for artists that an agency as the creative process? What do you think of that?
Right. I mean, I think what Brett was saying about artists having their own voice is really essential because, that's what I'm attracted to in art is when I see the artist's message and voice and their hand in the work, right? And so as these tools, as they're marketed to us as artists, like we have to be creative and figure out ways to keep our voice in that process. And, and maybe it's getting more challenging to do that, but the constraints also, like we can live up to them and be creative and figure out new ways to deal with them. And I think artists have done that, forever in different ways in a sense. So we just have to rise to that occasion of like showing our humanity in the face of increasingly powerful technology.
Thank you. Generative AI uses stolen work from smaller artists, uncredited, on top of the environmental repercussions. How would you justify the use of artificial generative intelligence despite these issues? What do you think, Sharifa? I feel like this, comes back to some of the education that you were just sharing with us, which was wonderful. What do you think about this?
Hey, can you repeat the questions?
Absolutely. Generative AI uses stolen work from smaller artists, uncredited, on top of the environmental repercussions. How can we justify the use of generative AI despite these issues?
Yeah. Second time didn't help as much. That's a really good question because the training material is theft. Now, copyright stuff is happening, right? There's a big lawsuit at the New York Times with OpenAI because they trained without permission. But it's millions and millions of, every website, every art has just been completely vacuumed up. And so copyright law doesn't really protect against that. But it's still a sort of theft because it's a theft of labor and time. A lot of artists have seen their stuff on there, and it's, it's heartbreaking when you've worked so hard, you're not making any money, and then suddenly people can just like replace you, right? So on the ethical side of that, it's difficult to say that it's okay to use it, right? But individual use and putting it upon an individual person and the choices that they make is also very unethical. But it's not about an individual using the tool. Like, I don't feel bad when I use AI tools, right? I use them a lot because I'm often testing them and seeing where they break and seeing what their problems are, right? And I do get like some, like, oh, this is bad for the environment kind of feelings, but it's not about our individual use. That's something to make us feel like it's up to us, but it isn't. It's about a collective sort of pushing back. It's about those policies.
Kind of adding on to that here, can you talk about the relationship between art and human communication in your artworks? How does it speak to the people? What do you think on that, Brett?
I don't really know. The work I'm making now is not as accessible as the work I was making before. And I think it's partly because I'm still figuring out what that thing is. I've always been of the camp to make it accessible for everyone. That's why I think street art's so good, because it's like you don't need a PhD or MFA to understand what the artist is talking about or trying to communicate. I think powerful art can grab you visually and conceptually, intellectually. I think the power of metaphor is important, especially like the stuff I'm doing right now. Like I'm trying to communicate in certain things that concern me, but using a made-up language to communicate these ideas without hitting people over the head of like these ethical implications of what the technology could potentially cause or where it could potentially go. I'm kind of both camps of I want the work to grab you visually, and I want the work to speak for itself, but also like when the viewer has to work a little bit to, like get to the truth of the work. So yeah, I'm not really quite sure. I mean, I would say right now where I'm at with my own work is, it's definitely communicating certain ideas, but I think the viewer has to do a little work to get to the I don't know, what's behind the curtain.
Yeah.
But again, this what I'm doing right now is relatively new, and I think it's going to take some time for me to like unravel, and simplify and make it more accessible. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Absolutely. Let's take this back a step. Who owns the copyright when you create art in, say, Midjourney or DALL-E or beyond? Whose art is it?
AI art's not copyrightable.
I kind of think, I kind of relate it to like postmodernism, where everything was appropriated. Ready-mades. Hip hop, like in the 90s and then 2000s where everything was just remix culture. I had work when I was doing another body of work. I had this artist steal my work or like copy my paintings and exhibit my paintings in galleries, and that sucked. You can. My work has been scraped. Like when the text image generation started, you could put in a Brett Amory Waiting painting. It would generate a AI image that looked like a Brett Amory Waiting painting. But I'm kind of like the way I think about it is it's up to the artist to reinterpret and own it, and like. It's not. I think it sucks that like artists' work's being stolen, but it's not a new thing. I think it's been happening for a long time.
Let's add on to that. You take us down a really interesting road here. So, kind of tapping into this next question here in the question cards, Marshall McLuhan, 1964, writes that, or says rather, in a debate, that I see that great art is an early distant warning system. It's used to warn the old culture what is about to happen to it because of the new culture, and that art is preparing the old culture for the psychosocial impacts that are about to take place. If Marshall McLuhan still holds true today that art is this early distant warning system, what are the three of you, what are your artworks warning us? What are the psychosocial impacts?
I'm trying to create something that maybe doesn't explain itself, but the power behind it is, or the concept behind it that I'm putting into it is kind of about this connection between AI and art, or AI and the brain and nature, and that doesn't really change. To me, that feels almost timeless. I'm searching for those timeless qualities. Of course, it's very timely also with AI coming out, but I'm trying to find those timeless qualities that exist. They're like primal qualities.
Mm-hmm. I think for myself, is like I really identify with a lot of things that you talked about in your presentation. It bothered, like, I grew up in Virginia, skateboarding, punk rock. A lot of the friends that I grew up with are libertarians. They're ones that never left. And, like, when Trump was first elected, the first time around, we would have conversations and we would clash. And I thought it was disturbing that, like, we couldn't even talk about politics in a civil way without getting emotional. And I started thinking about like the way the country is being divided, and like the ways, surveillance capitalism and like algorithms and like manipulation of emotion, all these things were playing into it. And I couldn't help but think that there's something happening, in the middle where if you get both sides fighting each other, then we're distracted enough, and it's the power of manipulation and magic to implement more, like modes of control or whatever, So like some of the things that I've been thinking more and more about is like what Trevor Paglin's been talking about lately, like psyop capitalism, and like using advanced technologies for persuasion and manipulation and to categorize and herd and so I don't know if some of the work I've been thinking about and like starting to kind of play with is considering some of these like power dynamics or manipulative sort of like structures that are being implemented. But yeah,
some of those ideas, if we could pull that into what you said during your presentation, which I thought was great, is every time you hear smart, replace it with the word surveillance. Smart home, smart phone, surveillance phones, surveillance. How can you add on to some of what Brett's saying and to give a bit of context to Trevor Paglin's work, this idea of, we were talking earlier about the idea Silicon Valley in some ways becomes effectively a proxy for social engineering. They have so much data on so many people. How do you think about this with your work and some of what your current project is?
Yeah, so you guys want to hear my theory of art? Okay, good. Okay, great. We're all on board. So for me, art is, because I'm a conceptual artist, art is just like the middle between things. So I make an art, it no longer belongs to me, it belongs to the viewer. And it's a middleman between the viewer and anything else. So in some ways, the artist can be an antenna, right? All art is, between you and beauty, or you and whatever painting it is that you're doing, whatever you're trying to reach, it like makes that, it's connection. That's what it makes, And so in my work where I'm being critical, I'm not trying to just tell people stuff. I'm trying to move them with some emotion. They can see that I care. I want to connect to people. I want them to experience how I feel about AI and come with me on that journey and try to shift their lens a little bit, And then I also want to view and hear back, right? I want to be that middleman between something and something else, because art throughout history has always meant so many different things, and it's always been so expansive, like the history of art. It's just like, oh, it's only paintings. Oh, actually, we're going to do performance art. We're going to do video art. It's just growing and growing and expansive. Mm-hmm. And I find AI and what Silicon Valley is doing very reductive, very limiting. That art should look like this. It should be on a computer. And it's going to, be only what we've trained on. Most of art does not exist on the internet. It's all over. Most of our language, what we say, what we've written, it's not all on the internet. None of that is captured. So when we reproduce stuff with AI, we are constantly limiting and reducing, making it less. And I think art, we have like artists, we have a duty to be this expansive thing, Art can be a thing that is a moment of healing. It is one of the most powerful things in the world, because like a lot of fear is running around with AI. Is AI going to take our jobs? Is it going to like ruin the world? All sorts of things. And art is much more powerful than that fear. Because art, when someone sees art, they get moved by it and they love it. That is a much more powerful emotion than fear. Fear, you might kill somebody because you're afraid, but if you love, you could run into a burning building and save them. So that's like what I think is a good counterpoint to Silicon Valley, is the work of artists, which has never, which is always constantly very, very important. And it's extremely crucial now in this time that we're living in like a turducken of like crises, right? A pandemic, climate change, politics all around the world, war. We have a response, we have a duty, like we need to survive together.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We got time for one more question here. At the start of the evening, I ask everyone in the audience here, raise your hand if you identify as an artist or arts professional, and 40+% of the hands go up. What is, coming back to something that you said in your talk, and I mentioned in introducing you, Anna, is this idea of collaboration and the idea of reaching across, with Bjork, right, a musician, with your husband, someone in your house, so on. This idea of collaboration becomes profound, and you mentioned it as well, Sharifa, this idea of it being a communicative tool for with AI and so on. So Nightshade or glazing. So to give a bit of context to the audience here, the idea of nightshade or glazing is this idea of almost like a defense mechanism of something that can be installed into the images that you create of you take a photo of your painting, you can install this in there so that if it tries to be scraped and used by an artificial intelligence model, that it will not function properly, effectively. What do you say to the 40+% of the creators here this evening, that how should they look at this? Be empowered? Should they put their head in the sand? Should they reach out? What do you say for take action to people?
You're asking me about
Absolutely.
about this nightshade algorithm. I've never used it, but I'm not trying to. I don't think an AI algorithm would be very interested in what I'm making. You know. I think it's very personal choice, right? It depends on what you're trying to protect and why, and to what extent you want to do it. But I think it's reasonable to, want to think about it at least. Think seriously about like how much you want to just freely offer your work, your imagery, as you said, to connect people and put it out there like you're the antenna as the artist versus a more locked down approach. Yeah. But I personally don't do anything.
Perhaps, Brett, can you add on to that? I mean, you're someone who, like you said, 25 years of traditional art painting practice, and here you are, experimenting with this new media. What do you tell artists here in the audience, the idea of how to think about either protecting their work from being scraped, or should they dive right in? How do you think about that?
I mean, I think if you're really concerned about your images or your work being taken, then yeah, maybe protect it.
Do you?
I don't know, because I think if someone's going to steal your work, then they're always going to be a step behind. Like a biter is always going to be a biter. A copier is always going to be a copier. So like, it doesn't really concern me. If someone wants to steal my work, then that's fine. I'm always going to be a step ahead. I encourage artists to embrace these technologies because they're not going anywhere. I mean, I think it's important to be critical. But being that these technologies are so accessible now, where you don't really necessarily have to have a degree in programming or a CS degree to use them, it enables your scaling of your practice. Like my work has changed more in the last 3 years than it has in 20 years. And I'm doing like all these projects that outside of just painting that I've always wanted to do, but I couldn't do because I was limited because of like not knowing how to do certain things. I feel like every month something new comes out that like I can utilize for a different aspect of a project that I couldn't do before. So that scaling aspect of like my own practice and like this sort of, it's just the way like this language project is turned into like a world building project, and it's turned into something much bigger than I initially anticipated, is I think it's something that like is only possible because these technologies are accessible. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for not just coming out and supporting live events, but for participating in them through your shared curiosity. Thank you very much to the Commonwealth Club. Thank you to Mark Kirshner for making our sound quality crystal clear this evening. Thank you to Gerald Harris for taking this event from what was once just a thought and turning it into a thing. Thank you to the Commonwealth Club staff who put in a ton of energy to make an event like this come to life. Thank you to yourselves. And now we are going to, in just one moment, go out behind those double doors and continue this very important civic discourse. So if your question was not asked, please ask that question over a glass of wine. And one final time, through a round of applause, thank you to our artists.